Okay, so get ready because today we're really going to dive deep into this fascinating world of Indigenous-led mental wellness in Canada.
Hmm.
Really want to understand not just the what, but the how.
Yeah,
So imagine like a space where the people who are impacted by the solutions are actually the ones crafting them.
right.
That's the energy we saw at the 2024 National Summit on Indigenous Mental Wellness, and we're going to unpack all those insights.
Yeah, it's an area that's so full of innovation. It's really amazing to see Indigenous communities taking the lead in developing these mental health approaches that are so grounded in their cultures and community. And I think there's a lot we can learn from these experiences.
So you mentioned the 2024 summit. Can you kind of set the stage for us? Who was there? What was the overall vibe?
Yeah, so picture this. Leaders from First Nations, Inuit, and Métis communities all across Canada all gathered in one place. But it wasn't just leaders. We're talking mental health workers, elders, youth, academics, everyone united with this common goal of finding real, tangible ways to improve these mental wellness services for Indigenous peoples.
Hmm.
And you know what really made this summit stand out?
Right.
It was Indigenous-led entirely.
That feels significant. I mean, we've heard countless stories about programs being imposed on communities rather than developed with them.
Yeah, and for far too long, Indigenous communities have been told what their mental health needs were instead of being empowered to define that for themselves.
Yeah.
So this summit signals a really powerful reclaiming of agency. It's about recognizing that the solutions to Indigenous mental health lie within Indigenous communities themselves.
So rather than imposing solutions from the outside, this summit was about amplifying those Indigenous voices and approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the most fascinating takeaways from the summit was this emphasis on the land initiatives.
Now that's intriguing. I feel like that's more than just a catchy phrase. What's the deeper meaning there?
To really get it, we need to kind of take a step back and consider the historical context here.
Okay.
Because colonization, with its legacy of residential schools, forced assimilation, and this ongoing systemic racism, has had a devastating impact on Indigenous communities and their mental well-being. It's like a wound that hasn't been allowed to heal,
Yeah.
you know?
So are these on-the-land initiatives about sort of like reclaiming something that was taken away?
In a way, yeah, but it goes beyond just going back to the way things were. It's about recognizing that for Indigenous peoples, healing is deeply intertwined with their cultural identity and their connection to the land.
Can you give us a concrete example? What might that look like in practice?
Sure, some initiatives might involve traditional healing practices that have been passed down for generations, things like sharing circles or ceremonies.
Yeah.
Others might focus on cultural camps, language revitalization programs, or even something as simple as just spending time on the land connecting with elders and community.
So it all comes back to what you were saying earlier, acknowledging that the solutions are found within these communities themselves and not imposed from outside.
Exactly.
This summit wasn't just talk, though. It sounds like there were some really concrete examples of how this is all being put into action. The material you provided mentioned frameworks and strategies actually being used by communities. One that jumped out at me was the First Nations Mental Wellness Continuum Framework.
Oh, that's a perfect example. You see, instead of taking a one-size-fits-all approach, this framework recognizes that First Nations communities are diverse and they have unique needs.
Okay, so tell me more about how it works, because that sounds really important.
So it's about understanding that what works for one community might not work for another, right? So this framework acts like a roadmap, offering guidance and support for each community to develop their own culturally grounded mental wellness programs.
That's so much more effective than trying to, shoehorn everyone into the same box.
Yeah.
And it sounds like this approach is gaining traction across Indigenous communities. Your research mentioned other initiatives with equally compelling names like Honoring Our Strengths and the National Inuit Suicide Prevention Strategy. Just the titles alone suggest a real shift in perspective.
You got it. It's about moving away from that deficit-based model where we only focus on the problems and instead embracing a strengths-based approach, celebrating that resilience, that cultural wisdom, the power of these Indigenous communities.
I love that. It's about empowerment, not just intervention. Having the resources and strategies is one thing, but what really struck me was the summit's emphasis on putting this knowledge into action. It wasn't just about creating documents, it was about creating change.
It's like we were saying earlier, you
Yeah.
can have the most brilliant plan in the world, but if it's not accessible, if people don't understand it, if it's not relevant to them, it's not going to work. That's another reason that this Indigenous-led approach is so revolutionary.
Because it makes sure that these programs are really designed by and for the communities.
Yes, exactly. It's about bridging that gap between Knowledge and action, making sure that all these great strategies actually translate into real benefits for people and communities. And, one of the most powerful examples of this was the summit's focus on youth mental wellness,
Oh, absolutely. You could just feel that sense of urgency.
and rightfully so. Indigenous youth face such a unique set of challenges, from the intergenerational trauma of colonization to the realities of racism and discrimination they face every day. And they're statistically much more likely to be affected by mental health issues. But here's the thing. The summit didn't just talk about youth, it actually gave them a real platform to share their stories, their struggles, and their solutions.
Yes, the material that you sent mentioned a youth panel and the involvement of organizations like We Matter and youth wellness hubs. These names alone suggest a real commitment to empowering these young people.
We Matter is an amazing example. It's an Indigenous youth-led organization that's all about promoting mental wellness and preventing suicide. They create these safe spaces for Indigenous youth to connect with each other, support each other, and get access to those culturally relevant resources. It's incredibly powerful.
And what about these youth wellness hubs? What makes them different from, say, a traditional mental health clinic?
It's about breaking down those barriers and meeting young people right where they are. So instead of expecting youth to navigate this complex system, these hubs offer like a one-stop shop for mental health services. They often include cultural elements, offer a variety of different services, and most importantly, they're in places that are comfortable and familiar for young people, like community centers or schools.
That makes so much sense. You're removing those obstacles,
Hmm.
logistical, cultural, even just the stigma that can prevent young people from seeking help. It's about making mental wellness support accessible and approachable.
Yeah.
This whole summit feels like a huge step forward, but it also sounds like there's a real understanding that this is just the beginning, would you say?
Definitely. There was so much energy at the summit, a real sense of hope, momentum, but also an understanding that to create lasting change takes time and sustained effort. The summit was a catalyst, it sparked a conversation, and really set the stage for action.
So where do we go from here? It's clear that these Indigenous-led initiatives aren't just important for Indigenous communities, but they have valuable lessons for all of us.
I think that's right. At its core, this isn't just about mental health, it's about social justice, listening to voices that have been marginalized, understanding the impact of historical trauma, and recognizing that to truly heal, we have to address what's causing the suffering in the first place.
You've given us such a clear picture of the summit and this incredible work. I'm sure our listeners are wondering how we can turn this energy into action. What can we as individuals actually do to be a part of this movement?
It really starts with that question, recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable mental health system for everyone. And it begins with educating ourselves.
So you're talking about understanding the history, the impacts of colonization, how those things contribute to the disparities we see today.
Exactly. It's about connecting the past and the present and recognizing that these aren't just, indigenous issues. They are our issues, societal issues, and they demand all of us to respond. A huge part of that response is simply listening to Indigenous voices, amplifying them, supporting those Indigenous-led solutions, not imposing our own.
That makes a lot of sense. But how do we do that? Are there certain organizations we could support? Resources to tap into?
There are so many amazing organizations doing the work on the ground in communities across Canada. We're talking about groups providing mental health services that are culturally relevant, advocating for changes in policy, empowering Indigenous youth. Many of them really depend on public support to keep going.
So donations are always a good place to start.
Absolutely. Even a small amount can make a difference. But support goes beyond money, too. You can volunteer, share your skills, or even just help spread the word about these organizations and the vital work they do.
Just getting those voices out there can be so powerful, like you said, moving beyond awareness and into action.
Exactly. And don't underestimate those conversations in your own life, too. Talk to your friends, family, colleagues about this. Challenge those stereotypes. The more we have these conversations, the more we create space for understanding, for empathy, and for change.
I love that. We're all connected and we all have a responsibility to build a more compassionate world.
It's about recognizing how resilient Indigenous communities are, their wisdom, and the contributions they make to all of our well-being.
And that feels like the perfect note to end on. As we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Indigenous-led mental wellness in Canada, we encourage you, our listeners, to think about what really resonated with you today, what sparked your curiosity, and what one small action can you take today to learn more about these initiatives in your own community. Even the smallest actions, multiplied across the country, can create ripples of change that can truly transform lives.